a dynamic in humanity that operates in all of us to one degree or another, at some point or another, in one relationship or another, in one decision-making process or another, in one social dynamic or another, we would refer to as narcissism or unilateral ego intention, having what we want our way now or always, being able to control the external environment, control other people, control the world, control results, and have our desires met and have our fears assuaged via that dynamic of control. Narcissism is a dynamic of projection of recordings in our systems that we would refer to as either beliefs or simulacra or approximations of the meaning and implication of our prior experiences being projected so unilaterally onto the world in such an echo chamber sort of way that we can't hear other people. We don't want to talk and understand their perspectives or them as a human being or a soul or as a process of love or spirit. And this dynamic of narcissism operates at all scales and levels in humanity, whether as individuals or families or groups or religions or nations or organizations. They can all operate at some point in very self-centered, selfish, unilateral, and non-empathetic, non-caring, non-compassionate, insensitive ways. So that's not a problem. That's something for us to grow through and out of. And that dynamic has resulted in what might be termed global control strategies of the collective ego, trying to subjugate our ecosystem to our personal feeding drives and preferences and desires and will. And of course, that's creating a lot of global warming symptomology, a lot of pollution, and that's leading to running out of resources and competition for resources, which is again tribal. So we would suggest that in all cultures and in all families, there are what might be termed limiting collar structures. So I'm going to utilize a terrible metaphor. I apologize for even using it or communicating it. Still, it does make the point. If you've ever seen documentaries that show animals that have been abused in various places where they had a collar that was put on them when they were a puppy and it was never adjusted, and they were fed as much as they were fed, and as they grew, their collar remained the same size, and it literally grew into their necks and their throats, and their fur grew over the collar. That constraint is a metaphor, that physical constraint is a metaphor for the energetic and social and conditioning and belief system constraints and cultural constraints of our world, and tribal cultural constraints that are exacted upon men and women in our world and children constantly and various populations. And they are formative, certainly. They generate cultural dynamics that we would appreciate in some ways and laud and say, well, that generated Italian food, so it's fantastic. Or that generated an excellent kind of haiku poetry, or that culture generated a dynamic of celebration at certain points in the year that are just beautiful and wonderful. That religious approach has generated Christmas, for example, or Hanukkah. So which are seen as beautiful things. Paradoxically, there are limiting dynamics that create a lot of pain and suffering. And we're just listing some here. They're not problems. No one's done anything wrong. This is not a dynamic of judgment. It's a description of an unconscious, accepted social dynamic and process that operates in every culture of the world to one degree or another, or in every family, or in every tribe, or every organization. And it can be transcended. So there's a tradition of what's termed Japanese foot binding that is not as prevalent today as it was in the past. Small feet were perceived to be beautiful within the Japanese culture. Therefore, some people would bind the feet of the female children so that they would be sort of kept from growing in any direction that would end up looking like a large foot, or not the optimal kind of foot. And that foot binding process was incredibly painful and brought a lot of suffering, simultaneous to supposedly generating a kind of appearance or foot that would be found to be beautiful to the culture, the surrounding culture. And that kind of limiting evolutionary development was formative of the feet of some Japanese women, and was also very painful and could give them problems for the rest of their lives. If we could flip to the next slide just for a moment and say, this is one example of the result of Japanese foot binding that was designed to make beautiful small feet. Does it make sense that, some people died, some people got infections, some people suffered throughout their lives in order to meet this social expectation, this view of beauty? If we could go to the earlier slide now. Thank you. So that's one example. In certain parts of Africa, there was a dynamic of placing metal rings around the throats of women because long necks were seen as beautiful. And they would add rings year by year until you had a woman with a very long neck. And if these rings were ever removed from their necks, because the muscles of their necks had never developed because the structure of the rings held their head up, they would suffocate potentially because they didn't have the throat musculature to allow them to live without these rings. In certain parts of the world, if women choose to run off with their beau, some male that they love, if that's not deemed acceptable by the family has been socially validated in killing their daughters for having not met their social expectations, their beliefs, their values, the support system for their family, if you will. In some nations, marriage is seen as a survival characteristic, a way to empower or to create wealth in the family or higher social status. So these social dynamics that are so obdurate, so very fixed and unyielding and not open to evolution, transformation, and learning are tremendously challenging. They're lumps in the oatmeal, so to speak, or the mashed potatoes that are very difficult to work out. There was a story just a couple of days ago of a mother who had her son literally behead her daughter for having fallen in love with a young man that she loved and wanted to marry. Can you imagine how does a human system become so disassociated from love and consciousness and care and family to be willing to have your own family member, your own son, kill your daughter right in front of you and validate that as appropriate choice and behavior? So these are extremes, and we apologize for utilizing these extremes for this discussion. That said, there are these fixed societal, energetic, and tribal and social structures operate expectationally as a spectrum, as a gambit, and they are here in the United States right now. They are operating in the United States and in every other country to one extent or another. If we want to transform the world, we must be able to meet such pre-existing traditional tribalized structures and unconscious dynamics that can be very destructive and suffering and pain producing with love, kindness, care, facilitation, honoring and respecting, humbly meeting them without judgment, with understanding, if we want to be able to work together constructively. So both men and women in America and in every other country have expectations that they operate under that are painful. In America, it's quite common for men to be, you're supposed to be strong and courageous and not emotional, stay in your head, think your way through things, be logical, analyze things, and not be emotionally vulnerable, not be empathetic, not be heartfelt and loving. And you're supposed to be competitive and get the job done no matter what, no matter how much pain you're required to go through. These are traditional, of course. Women have been, they're supposed, air quotes, supposed to be emotional and empathetic and incapable of being empowered and being decisive and effective in the world, and supposed to be supposedly less than men, less powerful, less respected, make less money. And while simultaneously, they're supposed to take care of the family, work endlessly, endure in silence the domination of men. And men are supposed to be dominant if they're really manly men in their relationships. And if they don't operate that way, supposedly they're not manly enough, or they're not meeting the social standard. These roles and these semi-fixed roles and dynamics are being broken down now, in part by a 50% divorce rate. The pain and suffering of our children is becoming motivational to both men and women to change these pre-existing dynamics in very foundational ways. And we can do better. We can learn without the pain, without the suffering, without the bashing of role against role and unconscious expectation model against unconscious expectation model, without bashing desire against desire or self-centered intention against self-centered intention. If we choose to, it's an opportunity. It's not a problem, it's a process, and it's an opportunity. And we hope through the WSS process to be facilitative in bringing conscious relationship, conscious empowerment to the feminine, recognition of transformational processes that men can go through that will allow them to feel what they feel and express what they feel openly without concern over being judged for having emotions, or for being a human being, or being a spiritual being, or being a loving, kind, caring being, or expressing their feminine side. And women having ways to express their own masculine sides constructively, effectively, and efficiently in the world, and thus contribute collaboratively and build this world together that we so very much need.